Welcome back. Okay, so this session is a little bit interesting because it's different from what we covered this morning. But this is a topic that, again, is very much in our culture today, and the Bible does talk about this, right? So where did the different races come from? So if anyone was not here this morning, I work for Creation Ministries, and we have a website, creation.com. Lots of free articles that we have there. Follow us on social media, YouTube. We have a lot of discussions on these issues as well. So a little bit of my background, as I mentioned earlier today, that I spent 4 years in Australia. And when I was there, I was actively involved with an open-air street preaching ministry. And I remember there was one day when I was sharing the gospel where a guy came up to me, and he would be what you would call a white Caucasian guy. And he looked at me, and he started arguing with me. But this was interesting because normally I have actually interacted with what you would call white supremacists. But this guy wasn't a white supremacist. He was an Asian supremacist. And so this was really weird because I was there and I was telling him that we are all equal, we are all made in the image of God. And he's looking at me and he's arguing, he's saying, no, I'm superior over him. So that was a very strange thing. So why did he have this idea that Chinese is superior to the so-called whites? Well, we will see where he get that idea from. But let me just mention that in this talk, I think the Bible is very clear that we are all of one blood. We all came from Adam. So in this talk, when I mention race, what I'm really talking about is different people groups, descendants of the 3 sons of Noah. But to understand why this guy had that idea, we need to understand a little bit about history, evolutionary history. So if you go to the Smithsonian website, you'll see this picture. So this is what we will call the ape parade. On the left side, you have an ape-like looking creature. On the right side, you have a white man. In between, you have all the so-called missing links. Right, this picture is stuck in many people's mind today. Of course, no evolutionists actually believe in this, but we'll cover that in a while. But when we have this article on our website, we ask a question. You see that why is it that those in the middle are always given dark skin? So people wrote into us, got very upset. No, that is not dark skin. That's just the color of hair. Is that the case? Let's go to the Smithsonian Museum itself. Well, here in the Smithsonian Museum, we have many humans. How do you know humans? They're Homo. They're not the ape-like creatures. These are Homo heidelbergensis, Homo erectus, Homo floresiensis. They're all Homo, meaning they're all humans. But evolutionists regard them as half-evolved. Let me ask you a question. Is it just dark hair or is it dark skin? Dark skin. Why is that? Here's another one. Does anybody want to guess what hominid is this? Anybody? Well, that's actually my boss, Gary Bates. Well, yeah, you laugh, but he gave me the permission to use this. You see, in the museum, they even have a computer program where they can take a picture of yourself and they try to morph it to one of these so-called ape-like creatures. And notice again, they give you ape-like creatures and very dark skin. Why do they get this idea from? Let's go back into history. Who has heard of human zoos? Anybody? Not many people have heard of this because this is something that has been erased from a lot of our history books. But human zoos is exactly what it sounds. Putting people of different skin colors in zoos. Why do they do that? Because they believe that these are exhibitions. This is a way to train the public. These are living laboratories. So you can look at the different stages of human evolution. And human zoos are very popular in many of the major cities around the West. In the early 20th century, they have all these human zoos in America, in Europe, and so on. Because they used to believe that these different races are inferior stages or less evolved compared to the modern man. And a very well-known person in this human zoo is this guy by the name of Ota Benga. So who's Ota Benga? Well, his nickname is called the African Pygmy. Why do they call him that? Because he's short. But I'm not very tall myself, right? So in fact, if you were to stand beside me, he would be about here. That's about it. So he's short, but not really that short. And you can't really tell from this picture, but he's dark skinned, but not really dark. But they take him and they put him as one of the exhibits in the human zoo. first in the St. Louis World Fair, and 2 years later in the Bronx Zoo in New York. And they would call him the savage. Why? Because the word savage is actually the word that Charles Darwin used to describe the so-called other non-white races, 180 times just in his book alone. So he was placed in this zoo with other so-called pygmy. So why was he considered to be primitive? Well, he had dark skin and he was short. And this was a way the evolutionists would use to try to educate the public about the different stages of human evolution. So like I said, he was nicknamed the African pygmy, and he was placed in the zoo as the missing link, under the part of the zoo known as the ancient ancestors of man. So they placed him in the monkey house, in a cage, together with an orangutan. Of course, in this picture here, that's a chimpanzee. But in his normal place where he lived, he would be placed together with an orangutan. And you can see all around the zoo, we have people placed with all kinds of primates together in the same enclosure and in different parts of the zoo as different stages of human evolution. Otter Benga was just one example. In fact, when Otter Benga was in the United States, he was actually owned by 4 of the leading evolutionists of his day. The first guy was Samuel Philip Werner. So he was the explorer. He was the white supremacist. He went to Congo to bring Otter Benga back. In fact, in his diary, he talked about how he was horrified because on the ship, on the way back, he saw that the missionaries were actually having meals together with the African pygmies. And he was horrified because to him, these people, they are not fully human. So he was upset at that. But the second guy that owned him was William McGee, famous evolutionist. And William McGee wrote this book, The Trend of Human Progress. And in his book, he described how each of the so-called race is a different stage of human evolution. The third guy that owned him, again, a very well-known evolutionist of his day, William Temple Hornaday, the director of the Bronx Zoo himself. Right, in his book, he said that Otter Benga is a genuine pygmy belonging to the sub-race, commonly miscalled the dwarf. Sub-race, not fully human. In fact, in this talk, I will quote a lot of people that's highly racist, and that should make you upset. And that's a good thing, so that we don't repeat the mistakes of the past. But he was called a sub-race, the dwarf. And finally, the last guy, Madison Grant, the founder of the Bronx Zoo himself. Again, he was a leading racist, evolutionist, the author of Hitler's favorite book, The Passing of a Great Race. In his book, he talked about how we need to implement a rigid system of selection through the elimination of those who are weak or unfit. Does that sound like something in World War II? Hitler called Madison Grant's book his Bible. 3 years after he wrote his book, Hitler rose to power in Germany. And we know the rest of the story. Otter Benga, he's not an exception. This was common in many of the cities in the United States. All this while, Christian leaders begin to protest these human zoos. So on one side, you have all these evolutionists that say, hey, look, evolution proved to us that one race is superior to the other. See, if you don't understand the history, you won't understand why they're all pushing for this racist view. You see, if evolution is true, then humanity must have been evolving for hundreds of thousands of years. That means that some people groups are going to be more evolved than other people groups. So they would say that if you believe in evolution, there is a necessity to believe in evolution. And on the other side, you have the Christians who say, oh no, we are all equal, we're all made in the image of God. You cannot put people like Otter Benga in zoos. That is not right. And here you have the New York Times. And the New York Times is really mocking these Christians. Right? And he's saying that these pygmies are very low on the human scale. The idea that men are all very much alike except for getting an education out of books is now far out of date. He's saying, you Christians, you do not know what you're talking about. Science shows that you are wrong. And it says that the pygmies are very low in the human scale. Sorry, they already read this, right? So my question to you is this. Did the Christians at the time, do they know anything about genetics? No, they don't. But they know what the Word of God says. And later you're going to see that what science tells us today actually match with what the Word of God says. So the Otabanga, you think that after World War II, they will all die away? Well, some of them did, but they did not all die out. In fact, the last human zoo is actually here in 1958, not that long ago. Let's see if you can watch this video that talks about it.
This photo was taken in Brussels in 1958. It's a picture of a human zoo, and it was not unique to Brussels. They had been hosted earlier in the century in London, Paris, New York, Oslo, and Hamburg. This typical village was set up for an exhibition in Belgium in 1897. Local Congolese spent their days in enclosures imitating village life. Visitors would jeer, laugh at, and ornamentalize them. One journalist who visited the fair wrote, "If there was no reaction, they threw money or bananas over the closure of bamboo." We don't know much about many of the people who were placed in the human zoos, but Otabanga, a young Congolese man, garnered fame. In 1906, he was taken to New York to become part of an exhibition at the Bronx Zoo. Banga reportedly believed he was hired to care for an elephant in the zoo, but instead he was given a home in the monkey house. After leaving the zoo, Banga found no comfort in America. Later in 1916, he shot himself in the heart. Human zoos have not been staged anywhere for 61 years, but one Belgian academic thinks mindsets still need to be changed.
Do you see that? So in case you're wondering why he has those sharp teeth, they file his teeth down to make him look fiercer, like one of these so-called savages. So another guy in the human zoo is this guy called Abraham. So who is he? Well, he's an Inuit. They used to call him Eskimos, but the name has gone out of fashion, so Inuit. And he was actually a convert. He was a Christian. He was converted by Moravian missionaries. He was very intelligent. He could speak multiple languages. His own native tongue, he could speak German, English, and the only reason why we know what he went through was because he wrote a diary that recorded everything that he went through. He could draw, he could write, he was described as very hardworking. Well, Abraham actually played the violin for his church. Well, he was taken to North America. He came with his whole family. He went to Europe as a zoo exhibit showing the different inferior stages of evolutionary progress. So I want you to imagine that guy in church who's playing the guitar or the violin or piano, you take him, you throw him in the zoo. Why? Because it's a different skin color. Because they believe in evolution, they used to say that he is subhuman, an inferior stage of human progress. When he was in the US, he was very depressed, and when he came back, he was not vaccinated, and one by one, his whole family came down with smallpox and died. He was the second last one in his family to die off. And before he died, he wrote this: "I do not long for earthly possessions, but this is what I long for, to see my relatives again, who are over there, to talk to them of the name of God as long as I live. I am a poor man who's dust." This poor guy, this Christian guy, plays in the zoo, all in the name of evolution. And here are other pictures that you can see in the St. Louis World Fair from different people groups being displayed there. In Australia, it's even worse because Australian Aboriginals, they were actually murdered, tens of thousands of them, as specimens for science. And they were actually killed for museum displays and so on. So there you go. The British museums today, you have 10,000 dead bodies of the non-white races, which they used to call missing links. Here in the Smithsonian in Washington, we have the remains of over 15,000 individuals of various races. In Australia, you even have museum pamphlets, brochures that will give instructions on how you can rob graves, how you can pluck up the bullet wounds in freshly killed Aboriginal specimens. Why could they do that? Because to them, these are not humans. We have missionary accounts of Aboriginal men, women, and children. They were little kids, imagine that, murdered, the skulls boiled down, and then exported overseas to collectors. Believe in evolution. That is what it led to. But why? Why this? Let's get back to Charles Darwin. What was the name of Charles Darwin's first book? People say The Origin of Species. If you buy his book online, that's the name they give you. That's a shortened title. His full title is actually On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. Of course, in this book, Charles Darwin did not talk about the origin of humanity. But in his second book, The Descent of Man, he became extremely racist. Charles Darwin wrote, "The civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace the savage races throughout the world." The word savage is the word that he used to describe the non-white races more than 180 times in his second book, The Descent of Man. Racism in the last century very much stemmed from a belief in evolutionary biology. He says this at the same time, the anthropomorphous apes, he's talking about the non-white human races, will no doubt be exterminated, and then the break between man and his nearest allies will then be wider. For it will intervene between men in a more civilized state, that means the white Caucasian, as we may hope, even between the Caucasian and some ape as low as a baboon, instead of, as now, between the Negro or Australian and the gorilla. Do you see that? That should make you angry. Here you have an expert on Charles Darwin. This professor, he tells us that by the time that Darwin wrote The Descent of Man in 1871, it's pretty clear that Darwin believed that the non-white races simply do not have the capacity to be elevated properly to civilized human beings. They are mentally and morally at a more limited level. In a sense, they are stuck at an earlier stage in the biological evolution of human species. Martin Lloyd-Jones, a famous Christian preacher, said this: "The origin of species, I suppose, has been more responsible for undermining people's faith and belief in the scriptures and in God's way of salvation than any other single book." So we already saw Charles Darwin was extremely racist. But I'm going to take you quickly down through history. You're going to see something. Throughout history, the early stages, evolutionists were extremely racist. But you're going to notice something else. Every 20 years or so, the so-called established model of human evolution gets completely thrown out and a whole new model takes its place. Yet each time evolutionists say, "You Christians, you do not know what you're talking about." So that was Charles Darwin earlier on. Let's go to one of Charles Darwin's contemporary, one of his biggest defenders, Thomas Huxley, famous evolutionist. He was such a staunch defender of Charles Darwin that he was given the name Darwin's Bulldog. And he writes in his book, "No rational man, cognizant of the fact, believed that the average Negro is the equal, still less superior, of the white man." 1871. Let's move forward again a few decades. Now we get, if that is Thomas Huxley, Darwin's Bulldog, in Germany, we have another staunch defender of Charles Darwin, Ernest Haeckel. So he was given the nickname Darwin's Doberman. And Ernest Haeckel is very much responsible for changing Germany into an evolution-believing country. His book is called The History of Creation. And in this book, he talked about how humanity can be divided into 12 separate species, which can be divided again into 36 different races. 12 different species, like cats and dogs, not fully human. And Haeckel's book became a top seller in Germany. So if you want to wonder, what happened in World War II? Why was Germany so racist? Well, it didn't start with Hitler. It goes all the way back there. Stephen Jay Gould, probably the leading historian as well as evolutionist in the 1970s, he said this: Haeckel's evolutionary racism, his call to the German people for racial purity and unflinching devotion to a just state, his belief that harsh, inexorable laws of evolution rule human civilization and nature alike, conferring upon favored races the right to dominate others. He said that all this contributed to the rise of Nazism. Is it just Germany? What about the United States? Well, in the United States, we have a famous trial, the Scopes trial. Who has heard of the Scopes trial? Right? A lot of it was revolving around this textbook, the teaching of evolution in classes. And they were using this textbook called a civic biology. Almost everything that they were used to, in this book to support evolution, almost all of it has been refuted. Evolutionists today don't even hold to these things. But let's look at what it says in this book. In teaching evolution, human evolution, it says this. At the present time, there exists upon the earth 5 races or varieties of men, each very different from the other in instincts, social custom, and to an extent in structure. These are the Ethiopian or Negro type originating in Africa, the Malay or brown race from the islands of Africa, of the Pacific, the American Indian, the Mongolian or yellow race, including the natives of China, Japan, and the Eskimos, and finally, the highest race type of all, the Caucasians, represented by the civilized white inhabitants of Europe and America. The book goes on to say this: it's not unfair to ask if the health and vigor of future generations of men and women on the earth may be improved by applying to them the laws of selection. Humanity will not allow this, but we do have the remedy of separating the sexes in asylums and other places, and in various races, preventing intermarriage and the possibility of perpetuating such a low and degenerate race. Remedies of this sort have been tried successfully in Europe and are now meeting with success in this country. People look at Europe and think, look at Germany, they're so racist. But they don't understand that the German evolutionists were highly influenced by the evolutionists here in the United States. This is 1914. See, you're going along history. Let's go back maybe 10 years after this. I want you to notice the evolutionary idea of human evolution has completely changed again, replaced by a whole new model, but again, highly racist. Now, in 1924, it says here, there are 3 fundamental human types, the white, the yellow, and the black, related respectively to the chimpanzee, the orang, and the gorilla. So depending on skin color, you have a different ape in your past. No, evolutionists today, they'll say, we don't believe that we came from the apes. We believe that we come from a common ape-like ancestor. Yes, that's right. That's what they believe today. But back then, they would actually believe that we came from the different apes. And you can actually tell your ancestry based on your skin color. So 1924, it says this: the intermixture of Mongolian blood with Europeans result in the production of idiots and imbeciles who greatly resemble the orang and the Mongolian in physical traits. This special type of imbecile represents a revision to a type which is phylogenetically lower than the white man. That means less evolved. There is here implied the inferiority of the yellow race. But the author is at pains to show that his imbecile has small skulls. How can we reconcile this with the fact that the yellow races have skulls as large, if not larger, than the Europeans? Remember at the start of this talk, I talked about how I had that strange conversation where the guy was saying that I'm superior over him. Where did he get the idea from? Evolutionary biology. Of course, the size of a person's brain doesn't tell you how smart it is. It's really the way that the brain is folded, the way it's structured, that makes a difference. Right? Some of you have big dogs, some of you have small dogs, and some of the big dogs are not the smartest. Okay, you can't just tell from the brain size alone. It doesn't work that way. In fact, some of the Nobel Prize winners in the past have really small brain, the brain capacity. So we can't just look at that, but that's what evolutionists used to teach. So if you go forward just a few more years, and now they do not believe that we came from the so-called apes, but they still believe that there's 4 major so-called races. And so here in 1966, now they don't believe that we came from the apes, but they believe that we come from the ape-like ancestors, the so-called missing links. And so here you have all the Australopithecines, the so-called ape-like missing links here. And what's interesting is this, is that even though the whole evolutionary model has changed again every 20 years, it's still highly racist. See, different lineages have been evolving on their own for different periods of time. So some people groups are going to be far more evolved. 1 year after this, so here you have the early man, and this is the very first time in this encyclopedia where you have the so-called ape parade. On one end, the ape, and on the other side, the human, the so-called Caucasian human, and in between, all the so-called mixing links. So that's the book. And now, even though go a few years, 1969 now, go forward, it says man is united in one species. So not multiple species now, one species. But it's racially divided into more than 30 subgroupings, which are distinct from one another in genetic type and details of physical appearance. So the white, flat nose and folded eyelids of the Mongolian, that means the Chinese people, are adapted to the vigor of the northern Asiatic cold. The dark skin of the Negro protects him from overdose of penetrating rays from the strong tropical sun. The saving of life for reproduction by ever more efficient medical technologies result in an increasing accumulation of detrimental mutations. Take note, this is long after World War II. Okay, on eugenics now, talking about eugenics and the pollution of gene pool, he said not so easy, however, is the question of whether a person who knows he carries a similar deleterious gene, a bad gene, has the right to have children. This is long after World War II, it's still continuing. Parents scoring low on intelligence tests tend to produce more children than those making high scores. Changes in the structure of taxation and in the award of family allowance and educational grant may already have removed some of the factors which have discouraged the more intelligent from having larger families. Muller has called the present trend a kind of natural selection in reverse. You still have the idea here of eugenics. In the 1980s, in National Geographic, again, the ape parade. All the candidates have changed, but this same image that you see here today. And right now, on the Smithsonian website, this image that is stuck in many people's minds today. And that is where we get our history of racism from. A belief, a promotion of evolutionary history. David Duke, notorious guy, right? Former Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan. A little bit of his background, he grew up with a Christian background, and then his father tried to reconcile evolution and Christianity. And as David Duke began to read more about evolution and the implications of the origin of the races, it's not surprising he began to reject the Bible. And if you talk to him, you ask why is he racist, you find that his belief in racism really boils down to two main things. One is his belief in evolution, and second is his belief in the millions of years, the great age of the earth. Because as we say, if you believe in evolution, then different people groups are evolving on their own for long periods of time. That means some people groups are going to be more evolved than other people groups. So earlier on, we mentioned Stephen Jay Gould, one of the leading evolutionists in the 1970s. He is not a racist. Okay, he's not a racist. But I want you to see what he wrote in his book. He says this, that biological arguments for racism may have been common before 1850, that means before Darwin wrote his book. But they increased by orders of magnitude following the acceptance of evolutionary theory. The litany is familiar. Cold, dispassionate, objective modern science show us that the races can be ranked on a scale of superiority. If this offends Christian morality or sentimental belief in human unity, so be it. Science must be free to proclaim unpleasant truths. Do you see what he's saying? He's not a racist, but he's saying that if you want to be a consistent evolutionist, evolution demands racism. The second thing he understands is what the Bible says, what the gospel teaches about the races, contradicts the whole idea of racism. Richard Dawkins, maybe one of the most famous evolutionists today, he says this, I'm a passionate Darwinian when it comes to science, when it comes to explaining the world. But I'm a passionate anti-Darwinian when it comes to morality and politics. So what would a consistent Darwinian be? Interesting, isn't it? See, many times when we turn on our media today, especially in the West, we hear about racism. It's in the news all the time, right? Black Lives Matter and all that. And what do they always pin the blame on? On slavery, right? Slavery. That's what they always say. But I want you to consider this. We already show that even Stephen Jay Gould said that racism increased by orders of magnitude. We see that, okay? But let's look at this. The Origin of Species, Charles Darwin's first book, it was written in 1859. This is more than one generation after slavery was already abolished. When Charles Darwin wrote his second book, it was extremely racist in 1871. That's more than 38 years after abolition of slavery in the British Empire and more than 6 years after the 13th Amendment in the United States. So what does that mean? Slavery was abolished in the West long before Darwin wrote his books, more than one generation. Yet racism only increased in orders of magnitude following the acceptance of evolutionary theory. See, historically, the justification for racism really had very little to do with slavery. It was long gone. The justification for racism was mainly from a belief in evolutionary theory. So why is this important? This is important because if you identify the wrong justification for racism, you're going to implement the wrong solution. Maybe I share a lot of things that's new to you today. Maybe it makes you upset, uncomfortable, and that is good. Because history is not there for us to like or dislike. History is there for us to learn. And if it makes us uncomfortable, that is good. So we will not repeat the mistakes of the past. Racism increased by orders of magnitude after Charles Darwin wrote his book. So here you have pictures of some of the people in the last century who were more responsible for the death of millions of people, more than perhaps any other people. What do they all share in common? Every single one of these people here that you see, every single one of them called Charles Darwin one of their favorite authors. Every single one of them. Francis Galton, father of eugenics, cousin of Charles Darwin. Margaret Sanger, right? She was a white supremacist, founder of Planned Parenthood. In fact, Darwin wrote this. He said that that means allowing the weak to survive or to breed, must be highly injurious to the race of man. Accepting in the case of man himself, hardly anyone is so ignorant as to allow his worst animals to breed. So Francis Galton, the father of eugenics, his cousin, well, it says here in this book that in the years leading up to the First World War, the eugenics movement looked like a Darwin family business. Darwin's son, Leonard, replaced his cousin Galton, Francis Galton, as the chairman of the National Eugenics Society in 1911. Eugenics is the killing of the weak, of the sick. In the same year, an offshoot of the society was formed in Cambridge. Among its leading members were three more of Charles Darwin's sons, Horace, Francis, and George. Margaret Sanger, a white supremacist, founder of Planned Parenthood, she wrote this in a book. The brain of Australian Aboriginals were only one step more evolved than the chimpanzees, and just under blacks, Jews, and Italians. So Sanger, in alliance with eugenics of a day, and through initiatives such as the Negro Project, she exploited black stereotypes in order to reduce the fertility of African Americans. So how did she do this? She placed her clinics in so-called black neighborhoods and neighborhoods of people that she would regard as non-white races. She was a white supremacist, and this was her way of purifying the so-called white races, encouraging them to reproduce more, and the non-white races trying to suppress them. Racial hygiene. So she writes this, that the campaign for birth control is practically identical in ideal with the final aims of eugenics. Birth control propaganda is thus the entering wedge for the eugenics educator. Upon this basis only, that means birth control, may we improve the quality of the race. The most urgent problem today is how to limit and discourage the over-fertility of the mentally and physically defective. Possibly drastic and Spartan methods may be forced upon society if it continues complacently to encourage the chance and chaotic breeding that results from stupidly cruel sentimentalism. Our greatest need is, first of all, to cooperate in the formation of a code of sexual ethics based upon a thorough biological and psychological understanding of human nature. So what she's saying, we need to implement our own sexual ethics. If we can summon the bravery to do this, that means implement birth control, we shall best be serving the true interests of eugenics. It's not surprising then in the United States, but you may be surprised by this. But there were laws in the last century, laws against so-called mixed race marriages in 27 states here in the United States. That's more than half. Human breeding programs, forced sterilization of over 60,000 US citizens, and even euthanasia. So in Germany, you have this. Nazi propaganda firms, they say that we humans have transgressed the law of natural selection in the last decades. But what happened in Germany was very much implementing what the US evolutionists were teaching back then. Of course, when the Nazis got into power, they put this into practice. Not just the killing of Jews and the non-white races, but they even have, like what we read earlier on, the implementation of their own sexual ethics. So here you have what we call a Lebensborn, a birth house in Nazi Germany. So this was implemented in a bid to raise the birth rate of the so-called white or Aryan race. So what you have here, these birth houses are places where, if you're of the so-called Aryan race, the white race, you can go to these birth houses. You can have extramarital relationships, and then you can produce children. And the state would raise these kids up for the state. They encourage that. A new sexual ethics, completely contrary to what the Bible teaches. So what are these Lebensborn? Well, some of you older folks here, you may know about this Swedish band, ABBA, right? So Freda, she's one of these Lebensborn children. These Lebensborn children, 8,000 of them in Germany alone, in Norway about 10,000. It's estimated that in the Ukraine and Poland, more than 20,000, not only were they trying to make babies, but these kids were actually kidnapped from their parents. So this picture here, kidnapping of Polish children in front of their parents. Why? They kidnap these kids, and then they would try to segregate these kids. Those who are considered of having white parents, they were considered to be racially valuable. So they would be raised by the state, and allowed to be part of the German population with welfare benefits, away from their original parents. In fact, these kids, those who are actually, if you are considered to be valuable, well, you're given a lot of benefits, the best opportunities in society. The kids, some reports say that these kids, they're given baths twice a day. They're really, really valued. The second group, those who are acceptable. So they were raised up in foster parents, but without as much benefits as the first group. And the final groups are the unwanted. These are the non-white races. These kids, they were killed or they were placed in concentration camps to do hard labor. After the war, very few of these kids were actually returned to their parents. Very sad history. And this talk, we talk about racism. But a lot of these things on the left, on that tree, those are really just fruits of a much deeper issue. And yes, we do have to deal with those things. But there's a much deeper issue. It really depends on this issue. Who decides truth? You see, if we're just a product of evolution, evolving on our own for hundreds of thousands of years, then hey, who are you to tell me what is right and wrong? I decide what is truth. But if we believe that we are true, we are God's creation, there's a creator, we are his creation. One day we're going to stand before God to give an account for our life. If we truly believe that, then we cannot live our life any way we choose. We have to live our life for God. If God's our creator, we truly believe that, then everything on the left just collapses like this. So how then do we explain the things that we see out there? How then do we explain the differences that we see in the so-called different human groups? Well, evolutionists say that differences come from our DNA, right? So what's our DNA? Our DNA is really an instruction book. It contains the blueprints in letters A, T, G, and C that tells our body what to do, what to make. And so if evolution is true, then from that one single living cell to evolve into different life forms today, you're going to need a source of new information. Information in the way that leads to the progress of man. So for example, if you start with a living cell, amoeba, instruction, maybe like one book of instruction, for you to evolve into a horse, you need new information that code for new biological processes, eyes, legs, digestive process, and things like that. So we need a way to increase the information in the genome. So how do evolutionists answer this? Well, Richard Dawkins says this. It's a question that nobody except a creationist would ask. A real biologist finds it an easy question to answer. And the answer is that natural selection increases the information content of the genome all the time. That is what natural selection means. So they say, look at that. That's how we can explain how things evolve. Is that true? Well, what's natural selection? Who founded natural selection? People think that Charles Darwin talked about natural selection. Yes, he did. But natural selection was actually proposed one generation before Charles Darwin, 25 years, by Edward Blyth, a creationist. See, natural selection is part of the creation model. Imagine if you have two of each created kind on board the ark, and after the ark, they have to diversify very quickly to get the modern creatures and varieties that we see today. We need natural selection. It's part of the creation model for rapid adaptation. It's not an evolutionary model. Darwin came along, he took this natural selection, hijacked it, and input his own evolutionary worldview into it. Natural selection is not evolution. Stephen Jay Gould, he says this, evolution ranked as a standard item in biological discourse among pre-Darwinian creationists. So why is it that natural selection can give us variation, and why is that not evolution? Remember, for evolution to happen, you need a way to increase the information content in the genome. But how does natural selection work? Try to follow along with me. This is simplified, but this will help you to understand. So imagine here you have two dogs, and these two dogs, what's in the center? This round thing that represents the gene. So on the left side, you have a smooth round thing that represents short fur gene. The one on the right side represents long fur gene. You see this long thing? And so this dog has one copy of his DNA from his mom, one from his dad. Short fur and long fur. So this dog here, he actually has long fur gene. Okay, let me see. See? Medium fur gene. This dog has medium fur gene because of long and short fur. This dog here too has medium fur gene. So I want you to imagine these two dogs, they fall in love, they get married, and they have little puppies. What kind of puppies can they have? Well, if you have short fur from the dad, short fur from the mom, you're going to have a short fur dog. Long fur from dad, short fur from mom, or the other way around. What they're going to have? Medium fur dogs, just like their parents. And what happens if you have a long fur dog and a long fur from dad and long fur from mom? What will you get? A really fuzzy dog. So I want you to imagine, take all these dogs in just one generation, you throw them in Alaska, really cold in winter. Well, so what happened? Who will survive? The long fur dogs, the short fur and medium fur died out. Natural selection, right? And within one generation, you're going to get what kind of dogs? Only long fur dogs. So in 2 generations here, you have a dog that is completely different compared to its parents, the initial parents who had medium fur gene. Adaptation in just 2 generations. But notice something. Is that evolution? No. These dogs have all lost information for the short fur gene. Adaptation by removing genetic information. That's the opposite of what you require if you believe in evolution. Here's another way to look at it. A bag of M&Ms. If you pick out only the red-colored ones, after a while, guess what you're going to have? Red-colored ones. Right? Adaptation by removing those who are less fit. So natural selection doesn't increase the information. It removes genetic diversity. So those that are remaining can adapt very well to the environment. And the Bible tells us that creatures change after their own kind. So all these dogs do change, but they change into different kinds of dogs. As the Bible says in Genesis 1, more than 10 times reproduce after their own kind. So we know that all these domestic dogs today that we see, all were developed just a few hundred years ago by artificial selection. Genetics tell us today that the wolf, the coyote, domestic dog, dingoes, jackal, all these from the canine kind came from a wolf-like kind in the recent past. Similar, all the cats that we see today, all of them came from a cat-like ancestor, a feline kind on board Noah's Ark. So here's the world's biggest cat. Does anybody know what cat is this? That's a liger, right? So what's a liger? A liger is a cross between the lion and the tiger. They're all from the cat-like kind that are on board the ark, and very quickly after the flood, they've diversified to produce the cat-like creatures that we see today. You can even take a liger, you can cross it with a lion again to get a liger. So this is an article I wrote for Creation Magazine, liger. Look at that, fertile hybrids. You can take a leopard and a lion, cross it together, you get a leopard here. Here's a leopard, a lion-leopard hybrid. This shows that they're all from the cat-like kind that were on board the ark. Rapid diversification within a few hundred years after the flood. Here's a Thai liger. Take a liger, cross it with a tiger, you get a Thai liger. You can take a puma or a cougar, cross it with a leopard, and you get this cute little creature called a puma pet. The 39 species of cats that we see today all come from a cat-like ancestor on board the ark. Some of them, because of their size, they may not be able to hybridize directly. But in 5 steps, you can hybridize from the biggest big cat to the domestic cat at home. As the Bible says, they reproduce after their own kind. Lots of diversification. So what's a kind? What's the created kind? The created kind, in most cases, will fall somewhere in between what we will call the family or genus. We have to look at that on a case-by-case basis because this is just a human classification. So if you have 2 creatures on board the ark, the Bible says those who breathe air through its nostrils and the birds. Of course, the clean birds, we have 7 pair of each. But how many creatures would we have? So if the created kind is somewhere between the family and genus, we only have about 2 of each kind, 2,000 animals at the family level. If it's the genus level, that's 16,000 animals. And to be honest, in most cases, it's very likely to be at the family level. Even if you go to the species level, animals that breathe through the nostril and the birds, you're only talking about 60,000 animals. At the genus level, there's still more than enough space. The ark had more than enough space to store more than 100,000 sheep-like sized animals. Most animals are much smaller than that. So the modern varieties that we see today are just variations of the original kind that came off Noah's Ark. Does the Bible talk about rapid diversification within its kind? Let's take a look at this. The Bible in Genesis tells us that God created creatures to reproduce after its own kind. So here's let's have some fun, shall we? So here, this animal is a kama. A kama. So what's a kama? It's a cross between a camel and a llama. Okay, so that's the created kind that you see there. So that's the kama that you saw there. Here you have a wolfin. What's that? A cross between a whale and a dolphin. Here you have a pig and bull hybrid. I'm not sure what you call that. A beefalo. What's that? A cross between a buffalo and a cow. A liger. We saw that, lion, tiger. A paisley bear. What's that? Polar bear and grizzly bear. A zonkey, zebra and donkey. What about a zos? Zebra and horse. Right, the horse kind here. They can hybridize. And here we have a jeep or gib. I'm not sure how you pronounce that. But what's that? Sheep and goat hybrid. Okay, so here we're looking at the created kinds that came off the ark. And rapid speciation is actually taught in the Bible. In Genesis 15, it says here, but he said, "O Lord God, how am I to know that I shall possess it?" And he said to him, "Bring me a heifer 3 years old, a female goat 3 years old, a ram, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon." We saw a gib. Goats and rams, some of them can hybridize. They're the same created kind. Turtle dove and young pigeons, they can hybridize. The same created kind. This passage was written when Abraham was 75 to 86 years old. That's just 400 years after the flood. Yet these creatures that came off the ark had already diversified according to its created kind. Here's another one in Jacob's day, about 500 years after the flood. "Let me pass through all your flock today, removing from it every speckled and spotted sheep, and every black lamb, and the spotted and speckled among the goats, and they shall be my wages." 500 years, you can diversify. You can identify the difference between sheep and goat. There's the gap that you see there. About 500 to 600 years after the flood, we come to Job. Many people believe that Job lived around the time of Abraham. I'm actually writing a paper with Dr. Robert Carter. We show from the Bible and other sources that very likely he actually lived about 600 years after the flood, but still very soon after the flood. He says here, who has let the wild donkey go free? Who has loosened the bonds of the swift donkey? Do you give the horse his might? Do you clothe his neck with a mane? Donkey and horse, the horse kind. Rapid diversification after its kind. Natural selection. That's a creation model. But natural selection doesn't increase the information in the genome. It's a problem for evolution. So how do evolutionists explain all the new genetic information? They say, okay, maybe it's not natural selection. It comes from beneficial mutations. Right? Have you heard of beneficial mutations? Yes, they do. But what are mutations? They're copy mistakes in the DNA. I want you to imagine you write a book, and in the book you have typo in there. And each time you copy the book, you have more and more copy mistakes in there. And that is supposed to give you new information to make new biological structures. Does that work? No. But are there beneficial mutations? Yes, there are. Let's take a look at some of them. So I'm sure we have all heard of antibiotic-resistant bacteria. And this is one of the ways that it becomes resistant. So you have a normal bacteria here. You put antibiotics, and what it does is that it pumps antibiotic into its cell through pump in its cell wall. So, oh no, it takes in the poison, the toxin, and guess what? The bacteria dies. Okay? So now you have a mutant. You put the antibiotic in, and what happens is that genetic information has resulted in the pumps on the cell wall. It no longer works. On the membrane, cell membrane, it no longer works. And so guess what? It doesn't pump in the antibiotic. And now it becomes resistant. It's beneficial. But notice what happened. It comes about as a loss of information. The information that codes for the cell wall, the pump, is now destroyed. Beneficial mutation by losing information. Again, that is the opposite of what is required for evolution to happen. So earlier on, we saw that Charles Darwin talk about natural selection. Now he's talking about mutations increasing the information in the genome. So here we interview Richard Dawkins. And we asked Richard Dawkins, can you name an evolutionary process or mechanism that will increase the information in the genome? And I want you to listen to his answer.
Dawkins, can you give an example of a genetic mutation or an evolutionary process which can be seen to increase the information in the genome?
Do you hear his answer? This video has been cut short because after this, he made an excuse. He excused himself for half an hour. After he came back, he answered a completely different question. He never gave a single example. If evolution is true, we should not just find one or two examples of mutation that increases information. We should find millions of examples, and he cannot even name one. Here's Dr. John Sanford. You may, if you're into agriculture, may know him. He was the inventor of the gene gun. That's how they put genetically modified DNA into crops. Most of the GMOs that we see today, commercial farms, they were actually founded by this technology that he founded, the gene gun. Dr. John Sanford, he was an evolutionist. But as he began to look at the results, at the research more, he became a creationist. And he's highly involved with creationist research today. He says this, I'm still not convinced there is a single crystal clear example of a known mutation which unambiguously created information. There's certainly many mutations that have been described as beneficial, but most of these beneficial mutations have not created information, but rather destroyed it. So where's evolution? There's no mechanism for it there. So let's get back to where we were at the beginning of this talk. We talk about how evolution promotes this idea of the different races as different stages of human evolution. And we talk about how the Christian missionaries come along and say, no, we're all made in the image of God. We're all from one blood. We're all equal. Where do they get the idea from? Well, it says in Acts chapter 17, and he made from one blood every nation of men to dwell on all the face of the earth. We're all descendants of Adam and Eve. And we're all descendants of the three sons that came off the ark, the three sons of Noah. And because Jesus Christ come as our kinsman redeemer, our blood relative, as the last Adam that came all the way back from first Adam, because it's related to all of us, he can die in our place to take the penalty for our sins in our place. So that those of us who believe in him, one day will rise up with Christ, will reign with him forever. There will be no more death, no more disease, no more suffering. We are all from one blood, one human race. Here's a historian. She says this. In the earlier periods, one of the few persistent barriers to social Darwinist theory in Australia was the Christian doctrine that all human beings were of one blood. So the so-called people groups that we see today, we are all really different shades of the same skin color. All people groups that came as the sons of Adam and Eve. And during the Tower of Babel, God confused the languages and the nations spread out. And those people groups will begin to inbreed as isolated people groups, and that is where we gather of the distinct characteristics that we see today. So the so-called people groups, the yellow, black, red, and white, we're actually all really very much the same skin color, different shades of brown. See, our skin color comes from a pigment called melanin. Some of you have less. You call yourself white. But are you really white? No, you're not white. Take a piece of paper, that's white. Put that to your skin. You're not really white. Right? You're light brown. Some of you are a little bit pink because of the blood that runs under your blood vessels. Some of you are dark colored because you have a lot more of this melanin. But we're all really just different shades of the same skin color. So skin tone actually provides a certain survival advantage. Melanin is not just there for color. There's a distinct biological function. So if you have a lot of melanin, dark color, it protects you from UV light. The UV light actually destroys a type of vitamin B known as folic acid or folate. So if you're pregnant, and if a lady you're pregnant, you go to the hospital to test your folic acid levels, because the lack of folic acid may lead to birth defects, anemia, and a range of different tropical diseases. So dark skin color does provide a survival advantage where the sun is strong. At the same time, dark skin makes it harder for your body to produce enough vitamin C from the sun. So if you have dark skin color and you live in the polar regions, you're more likely to survive from a lack of vitamin D. And vitamin D is important for strong bones. Right? Without that, you get rickets and certain cancers as well. So light skin does provide some advantage in the polar regions. So there's a little bit of that pattern that you see there. But if you don't have the genetic diversity there, even if you place them in these places, it really doesn't help. Right? So for example, if you look at the Inuits or the so-called Eskimos, the Inuits, they have very dark skin color even though they live in the polar regions because they don't really have the genetic diversity for them to have light skin. But again, this is just all different ways of explaining the different skin color. It turns out that the skin color that we see today is very much just skin deep after all. The differences are just skin deep. But you say to me, how then do you explain the other things? Like, for example, I look at you, you have what you call an Asian eye. That's very different, right? Again, the differences are very minute. So what makes the Asian eye different from the European eye? Well, first of all, you have here you see you have a fat layer under the eye, and we have what we call an epicanthal fold. And this gives the so-called Asian eye. And most babies in gestation in the mother's womb, you have an epicanthal fold. But by 6 months, a lot of them begin to lose this epicanthal fold in development. Asians just retain the epicanthal fold. And so that's why they have the so-called Asian eye. In fact, in South Korea, plastic surgery is actually very popular there. Many people go to plastic surgery the same way you see a clinic. And some people, some Koreans, they want a more European-looking eye, a bigger eye. So they go to a plastic surgeon, and the plastic surgeon will cut this epicanthal fold. And that will give them a much bigger European-looking eye. Again, very minute differences. So if you try to group the human groups, the people groups that we see today by the skin color, you're going to see this arrangement there. So at the bottom here, you're going to see all the dark skin color here. You would think that they are the most closely related genetically, right? Turns out that's not true. This group that have the dark skin color, turns out that genetically, they're the most diverse from one another. So you cannot just look at skin color and say, look, we are closely related. It's much more complex than that. But the Bible is very clear. We are all one human family from Adam and Eve. Then during Noah's day, the 3 sons of Noah and the Tower of Babel, and like I say, and he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth. If that's the case, that we're all descendants of Noah about 4,300 years ago, that was the worldwide flood, and later on the Tower of Babel, then hey, there's not enough time for some people groups to be more evolved than other people groups. In other words, all these things are just minute. We are all one human family. So how then do you explain the skin color? This again is simplified, but this will explain something. If Adam and Eve were a medium brown and had the right genetic diversity, within one generation, it can have anywhere from the lightest light to the darkest dark in one generation. So take, for example, these 2 parents, they're medium brown skin, and their kids, these 2 kids, they're actually twins. One of them have dark skin, and one of them have light skin. Same parents, just the correct genetic diversity, because the parents are medium brown. So we have in Creation Magazine, the 2-tone twins. So Cheryl and Kevin's father is what you would call black Jamaican, and their mother is what you would call a white English. But in one generation, very easy. So we have looked at history, and we show that evolutionary belief throughout the years have always been changing. But all throughout the years, they've been saying that if you want to believe in evolution, you have to be a racist. We saw that evolutionary racism was very much the reason for the racism that we saw in the last century, long after racism had already been abolished. But what does genetics today tell us? Genetics has caught up with the Bible. Good science supports the Bible. Here you have a scientist, right, very much involved in the Human Genome Project. And he declares this. He says that the scientists at the National Institute of Health recently announced that they put together a draft of the entire sequence of the human genome. And the researchers had unanimously declared there's only one race, the human race. Evolutionists did not expect this. But this is what the Bible has been saying from the beginning of time. This is another one of the scientists. He says this, the concept of race from a genetic standpoint has been abolished. Evolutionists today agree that all humanity come from one man and one woman in the past. They call this mitochondria Eve and Y chromosome Adam. Of course, they don't believe in the biblical timeline. But what's mitochondria Eve? Mitochondria is really the power plant in every one of our cells. And it has its own DNA. And mitochondrial DNA is only passed down from the mother to its offspring through the female line. And we know that all humanity came from one woman in the past. Y chromosome is something that all guys have, X and Y chromosome. It's only passed down from the father to their sons. We all know that we all came from one human in the past. Evolutionists, the only thing they differ is that they try to put mitochondria Eve and Y chromosome Adam hundreds of thousands of years back. The Bible, we know, we all came from Adam and Eve about 6,000 years ago. So why do they call that? Why do they think it's hundreds of thousands of years ago? Because they assume the evolutionary dates. They assume that humanity, Homo sapiens, came about 200, 300,000 years ago. And then they take those years, then they look at our genetic diversity as humanity, and then they divide it based on their evolutionary assumptions. But there's a much better way to actually look at our DNA. We can actually measure it in the lab. That's called the pedigree method. So what is that? We can look at the grandfather, then look at his son, and look at the grandchild. And we can actually measure how fast mutations accumulate with each generation. It turns out each generation accumulates with about 100 more mutations than the previous generation. We are going downhill, genetic extinction. So if you start with what the Bible says about 6,000 years ago, a pair without any genetic mutation, by the time of the flood, narrow it down, genetic bottleneck to 3 sons of Noah. and then give it a timeline, biblical timeline, guess what happens? We match exactly what we expect to see today. And so this paper, not written by a creationist, right? In this paper, Trends in Genetics, it says this: if the high mutation rates seen in some human pedigrees, that means the rates we just discussed earlier on, if those are used to calculate the age of our most recent female ancestor, she would have lived just 6,000 years ago, a date more consistent with biblical Eve than the evolutionary timescale for mitochondria Eve. Genetics has caught up with what the Bible teaches. We can trace our genetics, how people migrate over the years, and we know from genetics that we all came from an ancestor around here in the Middle East area, a few thousand years ago. It's a biological fact. All humans belong to one race. Like the Bible says, we are all people everywhere made in the image of God. Therefore, Jesus Christ is related to us. He can come as our kinsman redeemer to pay the penalty for our sins, to provide salvation for those who believe in him. So what's the solution to racism? The gospel. So let us sum up this talk today. What have we covered? We have looked at the history. Right? We saw the impact of racism, of Darwinism on racism, Ota Benga, throughout the years, how they're always very racist, eugenics, Planned Parenthood, and all that. Then we look at genetics. We're going to see this, that humans and chimps could not have shared a common ancestors, because all humanity from what we see today, we are so similar. While chimpanzees, they're really far away. They cannot share a common ancestor. All humanity came from one man and one woman in the past. We see that all people groups that we see today, the differences are very minute. It's really just skin deep, skin color, eyes, other unique features. They're all very minute. And we show you that the Bible tells us there's only one human race, and science confirms this. We are all made in the image of God, all descendants of Adam and Eve. And Jesus came as our kinsman redeemer to redeem sinners to himself and to undo the curse that came in through the first man, Adam. The people groups that we see today, that's what we saw at the very beginning. So what's the answer? The solution is the gospel. The solution to racism is the gospel, because we start with what the Bible says. There's not enough time for one people group to be more superior than another people group. We are all made in the image of God. So Creation Magazine, you saw me talk about it today, so I do not want to waste too much time here. But one of the things that is in Creation Magazine, how many of you have heard of the claim that humans and chimps are less than 2% difference? Who has heard of that? Some of you. Well, if that's the case, there's still 60 million letters difference. There's not enough time for evolution to be true. If you're just 2% difference, evolution doesn't have enough time. But here's another question. Where did we get the idea that all humanity is 98.5% similar? This figure came from a bird expert in the 1970s. His name is Dr. John Elquist. Okay, we used to converse long emails back and forth. He passed away just a few years ago. Dr. John Elquist was one of the leading bird experts of his time. And using a method that no evolutionists use today, and no geneticists use today, because it's kind of outdated, he said that humanity and chimpanzees are 98.5% similar. He realized that if that is true, that gap is too big for evolution to be true. In the number of years, the evolutionists say we have a last common ancestor. So he went back into the data and he researched, and he became a creationist. And he rejected that figure. So if you ask him how similar is humanity compared to humans compared to chimps, you see that if you want to be fair, it's more than 85. It's more like 85 to 90% similar. So how then is it that evolutionists today still maintain this figure here? Well, we need to see how they actually count that. So humans, we have hundreds of gene families that are not found in chimps. Chimps have hundreds of gene families that are not found in humans. So they remove all those differences and compare the part that is similar enough. And the part that's similar enough to compare is structured so differently. So what they do, they use the human DNA as a template, and then they chop the chimpanzee DNA up. Then say, hey, look, this part matches. They take one from chromosome number 7 in there, this one from chromosome number 14, this one from chromosome number 1, reverse the order and put it in there. And only after they do that are they able to get 98.5% similarity. If 2% difference is a huge problem for evolution, this tells us humans and chimp did not have a common ancestor. There's no human evolution there. The Y chromosome that we mentioned earlier on, something that every man has, we pass that on to the male lineage. The chimpanzee half chromosome, half of it is completely missing. You cannot even compare it. And the other half that is similar enough to compare is only 70% similar. In contrast with chimpanzee, all human groups today, we're less than 0.2% difference. We're all one people group. The next time you hear this figure, 98.5% similar, somebody says that to you, go up to him and say, hey, do you know that the guy that came up with that figure, which by the way, in the 1970s, that was one generation before we even had the draft of the Human Genome Project. That person who came up with that figure became a creationist. He rejected that figure, and he was involved in creationist research. They don't tell you that, do they? So in Creation Magazine, so like I mentioned earlier on, designed for equipping and evangelism. And then when you pay for it, you got all the free gifts that we mentioned today. So where did the racist come from? Where did Cain get his wife? We answer that, Creation Answers book. Here's another one that you might be interested. You like a DVD? This is Dr. Robert Carter. Some of you might know him. He has this lecture, Ancient DNA. And inside here, we have a unique QR code that will allow you to actually watch streaming on your own computer or your TV if you don't have a DVD player as well, if you buy that. This one used to be $19. This was in the cinema about 2 years ago. It's dealing with not genetics, but dealing with human bones, the so-called ape man, missing links, Homo erectus, Neanderthals, Lucy, and all that. Very highly recommended. So they take this $19 DVD, they put it in a sleeve, and it's selling for $5. So if you want a bargain, this is something I highly recommend as well. Again, Creation Magazine, like I mentioned earlier on. So I would like to end off this talk here, but like all the other talks, I'd like to end off with a Bible verse. So we say that what the Bible says is that we're all one race, the human race. We're all one blood, all the way to Adam. Therefore, Jesus Christ can be our kinsman redeemer. But the Bible doesn't end with a cross. It ends in Genesis. In Genesis, it says this, and they sang a new song, saying, worthy are you to take the scroll and to open its seal. For you were slain, and by your blood you ransomed people for God from every tribe and language and people and nation. And you made them a kingdom and priests to our God, and they shall reign on the earth. Friends, what's the solution to racism? The gospel. Thank you.